Theodore here, and tonight's bulletin cuts straight through the noise surrounding Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively, a Hollywood power couple now being dragged into a storm of viral accusations, internet speculation, and resurfaced anecdotes that are being reframed in the harshest possible light. And let's be clear from the outset, what you are about to hear reflects claims, interpretations, and online narratives, not verified diagnoses or proven intent. Because when the internet decides to rewrite someone's character, nuance is usually the first casualty. And yet, the scale of this conversation demands we unpack it piece by piece, because what we're witnessing is not just celebrity gossip, it's a case study in how public personas collide with selective memory, digital archaeology, and a growing appetite for psychological labeling without credentials. Now, the central accusation being thrown around is the word sociopath, a term that carries serious clinical weight but is being used here more as a rhetorical weapon than a medical conclusion. And much of this narrative hinges on a resurfaced anecdote from Reynolds' past, specifically a story he himself once told in interviews about accidentally setting fire to a tree as a child, which allegedly led to damage at his elementary school. A story that in its original context appeared to be framed as a reckless childhood mistake told with dark humor, but in today's climate is being reframed as evidence of something far more sinister, with references to the so-called McDonald triad, a controversial and often misunderstood theory in psychology that links childhood behaviors like fire setting to later violent tendencies, though experts have long debated its reliability and warn against using it as a predictive tool. Yet online commentators are connecting dots with absolute certainty, pointing to archived headlines from publications like the Vancouver Sun and interpreting discrepancies in reported damage as proof of minimization or deception, when in reality, the gap between a damaged wing and a destroyed building could just as easily reflect journalistic variation or memory distortion over time. But that's not how viral narratives work. They thrive on escalation, not moderation. And from there, the conversation spirals outward, pulling in alleged anecdotes from unnamed classmates, supposed teachers, and anonymous online posts that paint a picture of a difficult, attention-seeking child. Descriptions like self-centered, loud, and manipulative being presented as early warning signs. Yet without verifiable sourcing, these remain claims layered on top of claims, building a psychological profile out of fragments that would never hold up under serious scrutiny. And still, the narrative gains traction because it aligns with a broader re-examination of Reynolds' public persona, the sarcastic, quick-witted humor that made him a global star, now being reinterpreted as passive-aggressive or even cruel. Moments that once drew laughs are now being dissected frame by frame, such as his widely circulated joke on The Late Show with David Letterman, where he quipped about using his wife as a human shield to protect their child, a line that in context was clearly meant as exaggerated, self-deprecating humor about parental instincts, but stripped of tone and delivered through a critical lens, it becomes something else entirely, a supposed glimpse into underlying values. And the same pattern repeats with his social media behavior. Those intentionally unflattering photos he posted of Blake Lively on birthdays and anniversaries, once celebrated as evidence of a playful, irreverent marriage dynamic, are now being reframed as subtle disrespect or even hostility, raising the question of whether the joke was ever mutual or if the audience simply assumed it was. And this reinterpretation extends into professional spaces as well, with anecdotes from co-stars like T.J. Miller being revisited, particularly claims that Reynolds made dismissive remarks during the filming of Deadpool, comments that could be read as either in-character improvisation or genuine condescension, depending on the lens you choose. And that's the central tension here. Every piece of evidence exists in a gray area where intent is impossible to prove, yet conclusions are being drawn with absolute confidence. And then there's the controversy involving his children, which has added another layer of discomfort to the discourse, specifically the decision to include his daughter in a film moment that required delivering an explicit line, a choice that some critics have labeled inappropriate or exploitative, especially given claims that she initially felt uncomfortable and had to repeat the line multiple times, though again, without full production context or direct statements from those involved, the story remains incomplete, yet emotionally charged enough to fuel outrage. And this is where the narrative begins to merge with broader criticisms of Hollywood parenting, where the line between family life and entertainment becomes blurred, and audiences project their own boundaries onto situations they only partially understand. And as this storm intensifies, it inevitably pulls in Blake Lively herself, with some commentators suggesting that she has been set up to fail, that her public controversies, including legal disputes and media backlash, are somehow connected to Reynolds' influence or decisions, a claim that shifts the narrative from individual behavior to relational dynamics, implying manipulation or imbalance within the marriage. Yet here again, we're dealing with speculation layered on speculation, because relationships, especially high-profile ones, are far more complex than any outsider narrative can capture. And while it's true that public appearances, like Reynolds' absence from certain legal proceedings involving Lively, have raised eyebrows, absence alone does not equal abandonment, and interpreting it as such requires assumptions that go far beyond available evidence. And still, the narrative persists, fueled by the Internet's tendency to connect unrelated dots into a single cohesive storyline, bringing in figures like Candace Owens, whose platform amplifies these claims, as well as peripheral mentions of individuals like Martha Stewart, whose light-hearted remarks about Reynolds have been reframed as subtle criticism, and even references to industry tensions involving people like Justin Baldoni, all woven together into a narrative that suggests a pattern, when in reality these moments may have entirely separate contexts and motivations. And that's the real story here, not whether Ryan Reynolds is or isn't what the Internet claims, but how quickly and confidently those claims take shape, how a mix of old interviews, second-hand anecdotes, and out-of-context jokes can be assembled into a psychological profile that feels convincing despite lacking solid grounding. And audiences, driven by curiosity and sometimes a desire to see behind the curtain, can blur the line between analysis and accusation, because once a label like sociopath enters the conversation, it doesn't just describe behavior, it defines identity. And that's a powerful, often dangerous shift, especially applied without expertise or accountability. And so, as this narrative continues to evolve, the most important thing to remember is that what we're seeing is not a definitive portrait of a person, but a reflection of how digital culture processes information, selectively, emotionally, and often without restraint, turning fragments into certainty and speculation into storyline. And whether this storm fades or intensifies will depend less on new facts and more on how willing audiences are to question the narratives they're being fed. Because in the end, the difference between a joke and a confession, between a flaw and a diagnosis, often comes down to perspective. And perspective, as we've seen, is something the Internet rarely agrees on.